I'm here in the so-called Genocide Museum in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it's a huge exhibition. I can't go through it all, but there's one interesting statistic here. The demolition of religious sites in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992 to 95. Look at the number of mosques. 614 mosques were deliberately destroyed by Christian forces, Serbian Orthodox forces, and 80 by Croat. These are Catholic forces. 307 mosques were damaged, 218 were completely destroyed, and so on. And this is part of the story of the genocide of the Bosnian Muslims in this country. This is the first genocide we've had in Europe since the Holocaust, before and during the Second World War, and it's often overlooked and forgotten about. There's a European amnesia about this genocide, as it officially is known, when Muslims in huge numbers were deliberately targeted by Christian forces and executed: women, children, babies, adults. There are many pictures on the wall which are too horrific to show, really, but it reminds me very much of what is happening in Palestine. It's very, very similar, another genocide. But this genocide is in Europe, in white Europe, if I can put it that way. And the people perpetuating this were fanatical Christians, and the victims overwhelmingly were white European indigenous Muslims. Very tragic, very tragic. 30 years ago this happened, 29 years ago to be precise, this year.
Recently, I got back from a trip to Bosnia in Southeast Europe. And in this video, I just want to share a few reflections on this trip. There are many things one could say. And I must say, before I went to Bosnia, my ignorance of that country, its people, its history, and that region was almost total, actually. So I've had to go on a steep learning curve to learn about its history. And there's a lot, obviously, that I still have to learn. But in this video, I really want to focus on one thing only. I found this a very shocking fact about Bosnia's history, which happened in the 1990s, and has largely, it seems, been forgotten, at least in Western Europe and in the United States. And what is this extraordinary event? Well, it is the genocide of the Bosnian Muslims, the Bosniaks, as they're known, in Bosnia. If I was to ask people randomly today about the last genocide in Europe, I'm pretty sure, like everyone, certainly in Britain, would say, well, the genocide of the Jews in, before and during the Second World War. But that's not actually true. After that, in the 1990s, as is well recognized and has been ruled to be so by various international organizations, an actual genocide took place in Europe. So who was doing what to whom? Well, the people doing the genociding, we know, were Christians, Christian militia, Christian forces who deliberately targeted European Muslims for extermination. And the numbers vary, but it's over 10,000 innocent men, women, children, babies were targeted and killed intentionally, simply because they were Muslims. Now, in a second, I'm going to share with you some words written by Abdul Hakim Murad from his book, Traveling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe. He's a professor at the University of Cambridge, otherwise known as Tim Winter, of course, as an English convert to Islam. And I want to acknowledge that the reason I even went to Bosnia, to Sarajevo, the capital, the main city of Bosnia, was through the generous invitation of the people of the foundation of the Ilija Izetbegović Foundation in Bosnia. And we did a wonderful interview there with some leading academics, and that's going to be put up on Blogging Theology soon, inshallah. And Ilija Izetbegović, who authored, amongst other things, this very famous book, Islam Between East and West, was born into a Bosnian family, educated in Sarajevo, the capital, and an extraordinary life. But he was elected president of the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1990, 3 weeks after the communists were outed in elections. There had been before that, of course, the Republic or the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and that kind of collapsed and broke up into different republics, one of which was the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, of which he was the first elected president. And Bosnia became independent from communist Yugoslavia. And then after that, you had the genocide began, and Christian militia, Serbian Orthodox Christians as a branch of Christianity, normally associated with peace and things like that. But in this case, they were very, very nationalistic, anti-Muslim, Islamophobic, and they invaded and they massacred, raped, destroyed mosques and property, driving millions out of their homes, and exterminated Muslims on a very men, women, and children on a large scale. So I just want to focus on this terrible historical event. Many other things one could say about the history of Bosnia, its people, its language, and so on. But this brief video is going to focus on that one single shocking event, and the fact that we seem today, at least in Western Europe and in the United States, to have forgotten about it completely, which is remarkable. And why is that? And who were these Muslims as well who were attacked and killed in this genocide? So that's the purpose of this short video. So I mentioned, excuse me, just recovering from a cold. I mentioned this book, Traveling Home, Essays on Islam and Europe. And in the fourth chapter of this book, which isn't about Bosnia overall, it's a collection of essays on different subjects, we have a chapter called Islamophobia and the Bosnian War. And I just want to read a few paragraphs from it. So Tim Winter writes the following. One of the most disturbing features of the war which devastated Bosnia between 1992 and 1995 was the widespread reluctance of Western politicians, churchmen, and newsmen to acknowledge the role which religion was playing in the conflict. It only seemed worth acknowledging during periodic denunciations of the risks of Islamic extremism, a phenomenon that, when pressed, journalists working in Bosnia conceded was rather elusive. The reality, which was frequently one of militant Orthodox extremism, in other words, Christian extremism, seems seldom to be frankly discussed. The war was, we were told, a contest between ethnic factions and driven by ancient hatreds. And the fact that its protagonists were divided primarily by religious and shared a race and a language, they were divided primarily by religion and shared a race and a language, was deemed insignificant. So in other words, the Bosnians, the Serbs, everyone shared a similar ethnic background and they shared the same language. What divided them was the division between Christianity and Islam, or at least the Orthodox Serbian understanding of Christianity and Sunni Islam in this case. Anti-Muslim prejudice was no doubt at work here. One may assume that had the Serbs and Catholics been Muslims and their victims Christians, then the Western mind would immediately have characterized the war as a case of violent Muslims murdering secular, integrated, democratic Christians. Since in Bosnia, the favored stereotypes were almost perfectly reversed, the memory has largely been dismissed, censored, and forgotten as an annoying and scarcely possible anomaly. A quarter century on, in fact, it's 29 years this year, and that official characterization, by and large, persists. Generally, it is the case that the European and American popular consciousness has consigned Bosnia to oblivion, although fewer than 3 decades have elapsed since over 9,000 Muslims were tipped into mass graves at Srebrenica, while the local UN commander accepted a glass of champagne from the victorious Serbian general, who then went off to church. And where Bosnia is still remembered, there is a dogged resistance to defining it as what it was, a war which, at least for its Orthodox Christian participants, was an intensely religious experience. It's a profoundly Christian experience for them. However, among European Muslims and a small but significant non-Muslim public around the world that uneasily recognizes that the crime of Srebrenica was far worse than that of 9/11, this comforting amnesia is rejected as an unacceptable whitewashing of crimes whose sectarian foundations must never be ignored. Now, a couple of comments here for me. Firstly, the Muslims we're talking about here are not from Pakistan. They're not from India. They're not from Saudi Arabia or the Middle East. These are indigenous white Europeans. And I make that point because in Europe, Muslims are seen usually as the other, as the foreigner, as the invader, as the outsider, as the immigrant. However wrong that characterization may be, in this case, indisputably, the Muslims involved here, all of them were white Europeans and have been Muslims for centuries. Bosnia is an indigenous white European Muslim country. Most people in Bosnia identify as Muslims. And there are a few other former republics of Yugoslavia like that as well. That's the first point. Secondly, that the genocide itself, the numbers far outweighed or far more died in Bosnia than they did on 9/11. Now, this is not a contest like some kind of a horrible, ghastly contest of who died more. But if you think about how 9/11 looms so powerfully in the European mind, the 2,000-3,000 terrible victims of that terrible event, it happened, of course, but far more, 3, 4, 5 times more people were killed in this terrorist genocide. And yet we don't remember it at all. And this happened in Europe, not in the United States, of course, for those of us who live in Europe. So that's interesting, and how we have forgotten about this genocide in the main. War crimes investigators, says Tim Winter, have consistently found that the Serbian forces, the Serbian Christian forces, placed religion, i.e. Christianity, at the very center of their hardline national vision, and that many of the most iconic atrocities bore a strongly religious aspect. In other words, they were explicitly Christian. And then Tim Winter quotes from a series of articles and journals and books which make comment on this genocide. I'll just read perhaps 3 brief ones. He writes, he quotes someone else who writes, in Bratunac, probably mispronounced that, Imam Mustafa was tortured before thousands of Muslim women, children, and old people at the town's soccer stadium. Serb guards, these are Christian guards, also ordered the cleric to cross himself, to the cross of Christ, as Catholics and Orthodox do. When he refused, excuse me, they beat him. They stuffed his mouth with sawdust, poured beer into his mouth, and then slit his throat. This is from a book by Roy Gutman, A Witness to Genocide, the first inside account of the horrors of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. It's published in 1993. Another account, routinely, Muslims held in concentration camps also taught, by the way, Muslims were held in concentration camps. White European Muslims were held in concentration camps. You can see photographs online, just like the Nazi concentration camps, camps run by Christians who were motivated by their Christian faith. I'm not saying, by the way, all Christians think like this. Of course they don't. But I'm saying that this was a Christian pogrom in Europe against Muslims. Muslims held in concentration camps also told had been forced by their captors to sing Chetnik songs or to make the sign of the cross. Suggestions to Muslims that they convert to Serbian Orthodoxy, in other words, to Christianity, could be viewed as yet another means to eliminate the Muslim presence. That's from another book by Norman Cigar, Genocide in Bosnia, The Policy of Ethnic Cleansing, published in 1995. In another work, almost from the first, the Serb-led war was accompanied by an assault against the Muslim religious and cultural tradition, an assault whose impact has become clear as scholars examine the pattern of destruction. Muslim clergymen, not that Islam has clergymen, but hey, Muslim clergymen have been dispersed, imprisoned, or killed, according to a variety of Muslim sources. National libraries and religious seminaries have been destroyed. And Bosnian scholars estimate that well over half of the mosques, over half of Bosnia's mosques, historical monuments, and libraries that comprise a 6th century old religious and cultural heritage have been wiped out. That's from the same book by Norman Cigar, Genocide in Bosnia. Now, in a second, I'm going to show a very, very short little video I recorded on my iPhone. It's about a minute long, in the Genocide Museum in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, which actually gives you the statistics of how many mosques were deliberately destroyed and damaged by the Christians in a pogrom of ethnic and religious cleansing. Remember, this wasn't an ethnic war. People didn't object to Bosnians because they were Bosnians. Everyone shared the same ethnic background. Everyone spoke the same language. This was a religious war. And another account, the film was shown in which the notorious Scorpions were seen killing children after having been blessed, first of all, by Father Magrillo. Again, there's a reference to that. So you had Christian priests blessing militia, who then went on to kill Muslim children. This is documented. Now, I could go on. There's further paragraph after paragraph of atrocities committed. I actually remember that it mentions here the symbols appeared in the 3-fingered hand gestures representing the Christian Trinity, in the images of sacred figures of Serbian religious mythology on their uniform, insignia, and so on. This is the sign that was used by the Serbian Christians. I remember seeing it actually all that time ago. And these were the people who went on to commit this genocide. So from that book, the 4th chapter, Essays on Islam in Europe, we have forgotten about the most recent genocide in Europe, whilst we also remember now and live through now an ongoing genocide in Palestine, where many in the West are still denying it's a genocide, or more awfully, are actively financing and giving legal and diplomatic cover, and of course giving weapons and money to the people who are doing this genocide, the Zionists. And all our governments in the West are complicit in that. So Europe, civilized, free, advanced, first world Europe, has its hands dripping in blood and genocide, even today, when they're not ignoring it in the past. Sorry to be so negative, but I just wanted to get that out there. There's much more to say about my trip to Bosnia, I'm glad to say, but this is not the video for that. This is just to mention about that terrible event in the 1990s, and that we should never forget, because if we forget, we may well be doomed to repeat the same thing, and that still may happen even in the future. God forbid. Until next time.